On this video, we learn a totally another way of doing gradients. This is done with a gradient mesh. I create a circle form and add a fill color to it. Next, I'll add some mesh points to this form with the mesh tool. You can find it from the left column of the tool panel when the tools are in two columns. A step up and right from the mesh tool, you can also see another tool with a net-like symbol. When you accidentally click this perspective grid tool, Illustrator will open a grid on top of the file. You can close this from the symbol on the top left. But you cannot close the grid with any other tool than the perspective grid tool. Now we continue with the mesh tool. When I have selected it, I put the cursor on top of a form. Now the cursor is mesh arrow plus. When I click, it will create one mesh nut. The nut is an anchor point that has a path running horizontal and vertically from. You can see that they try to mimic the form. I want to create a mesh grid that is quite symmetrical. For this, I create a new nut on the bottom right. It creates one more vertical and horizontal path. If I want one more vertical path, I click it on top of a horizontal line. Now I have a mesh with 6 nuts in the center. You can edit the mesh points with white arrow. All of the mesh points have their own color. So if I select the one on top left, I can change the color of that point. Now to be a lighter brown. Now this point is light brown, but the points around it are dark brown. The color is now changing as a gradient along the paths to all the directions. This is how the mesh grid works. I can select multiple points by shift clicking with the white arrow. Now all the 6 points in the center are light brown. Additionally to the points I created, all the points around the circle are also mesh points. So I can change their colors individually. I can use the mesh tool also with a bit more complicated forms. It also works well with rectangular forms. The mesh will have some problems with forms with a lot of corners. The mesh points are editable just like other anchor points. You can move them and edit their handles. If you want to make a mesh to a more complex form, it's better to do it first to a simpler form and then edit that form. Just like in the normal gradients, the mesh points have a color and an opacity. You can edit this by selecting a mesh point and changing the opacity from the second row. Now the point on the top right of the circle is transparent light brown. Because I can use the opacity on the gradients, I can use it as a blob of paint or light. Just like the radial gradients. I create a white circle, add a mesh point with the mesh tool to the center of the form. I select by drag selecting with the white arrow. I couldn't do this with the black arrow. It would select the whole of the form, not all the mesh points. When I've selected all of the points, I remove the center points from the selection by shift clicking. Now I have selected all the other points but the center mesh points. Now I can change these points to opacity 0. Now I have a white form that fades to the edges. If I want, I can change the opacity of the whole of the form by selecting the form with the black arrow and changing the opacity from the second row. These tools make it possible to vary organic gradients in Illustrator. You just need to be careful while using this. Be cautious of complex forms and try to have the mesh well done straight in the beginning. Editing the mesh is quite hard. You should also realize that the mesh is always created horizontally and vertically. So you should first make the form horizontally and vertically, and then rotate it. You can always add new mesh points to the form, and in the newest Illustrator editions, you can also remove them by selecting them and pressing delete. Try to create a mesh to different kind of forms. Try also create forms that break the mesh.